while you're pulling that stuff up, we're just gonna start with introductions. I'm pretty sure most of us know one another. My name is Asia. I'm the 4-H livestock coordinator, and we are happy to welcome Kyle Caires here. He was our judge for the Oahu County Show, and he is a animal scientist, has many years of experience in meat science. Sorry, and we're just glad that he did our carcass contest evaluation and that he is able to make this an educational opportunity. So we really appreciate you, Kyle, for taking time out of your busy schedule to educate us today about the carcass evaluation. So um,
Cool.
if you want to go
Thank
ahead
you.
and get started, we're recording the meeting just for anyone who is unable to attend today.
Okay, right on. Let me share this screen.
Okay.
Has it gone to full screen mode yet or no?
Yep, we see it.
Okay, awesome. So we're gonna go through the carcass results this year for the following the state farm fair. I don't know how many kiddos are on the call, but I used to be a 4-H'er in Hawaii, many years ago. Um, as did Bridget Napier, who's on the call. Okay, so we have some experience going back in our own time as a 4-H'er, and then, now we're still kind of in and around the industry, and we get to make contributions from time to time as well. So as we get into the results, we want to, obviously thank, some of the people who helped sponsor the event and provided funds associated with travel and some of the stuff behind the scenes with the fair and associated endeavors. One thing I feel like I'd be remiss not to talk about is the change over time. Can you all see this graphic? Is it displaying?
Yep.
Okay, so from the 1960s to now, I have news for you. Cattle have gotten a lot bigger. Okay, and the same thing also follows true for the 4-H program. The average slaughter weight in 1960 was about 1,000 pounds, and at that time, the hot carcass weight would have been about 656 pounds. Okay, that's for steers. Heifers would be a little lighter, as you could expect. In 1983, the year I was born, it was 1,150 pounds. And that gave you a 730 pound carcass. 2001, when I graduated high school, a 1,300 pound finished steer was standard and was starting to become small, according to the industry, and that produced an 800 pound carcass. And now here we are. And I might as well say this too, right? Asia was 2 years old when I graduated high school. When that time has passed us all by now. But in 2024, 1,500 pounds was considered a industry standard steer for a 4-H steer or a show steer. And again, getting a little smaller according to the rest of the industry as far as it was concerned, with a 923 pound carcass. Most of the beef that we harvested as a part of this deal fall between that 1150 and 1,300 pound live weight. One of the things that we can do is if we get these cattle fed a little harder, a little earlier, and get them up in the 1,200 plus pound. They don't all have to be elephants, okay? We don't have to make every steer a chameau, but I think getting those cattle up above 1,200 pounds will ensure a desirable eating experience. And we'll talk about some of those traits as we move forward to the presentation. How these cattle get bigger? Well, the first thing is improved genetics. Obviously, after you breed them, you need to feed them. So improved nutrition. We know more about like nutrient requirements and how to finish cattle, balanced diets, minerals, vitamins, all that stuff better than we did before. Obviously, there's been improved management, animal handling that goes into there, and also more days on feed. Cattle are on feed a lot longer now than they were 10 years ago, and 20 years ago, and 30 years ago. But now we have cattle that get big fast, and we also have cattle that keep getting bigger. So just like when you're driving, I don't know how many kids are on the call. You want to stay between the white lines on the road, right? But most of the time, you want to stay in your lane. Sometimes chasing extremes leads to bad things. Okay. The first thing we want to do is talk about the obvious, right? We're converting muscle to meat. Okay, we're going from a live animal to a carcass. So in many cases, a 1,250 pound steer is going to give you about 775 pounds of hot carcass weight. That's a dressing percentage of 62%. Dressing percentage can range as high as 68 and a half, 69%. I've seen on some double muscled cattle that were fed well, including some Angus. and it can be as low as 48 to 50%. Bridget and Kiave at Hawaii Meats, they see the real ramifications of dressing percentage every day. If you have cattle with a high dressing percent and you bought them live, guess what? You have more carcass to work with, right?
Hmm.
A higher carcass yield, that's a good thing, right?
Yep.
Okay. If you buy a bunch of cattle and then you kill them and they drop to like 50% and you were expecting, hey, I paid for these cattle thinking I was going to get 60% and they dress 51%, oh, you better call your boss and your banker because you're going to be in for a rough ride. Okay. And you can predict the way cattle are going to dress by how they're composed. If they have more muscle, guess what? They're going to dress higher. If they have more fat, they're also going to dress higher. If the cattle aren't filled with a bunch of, grass and water, well, guess what? They're also going to dress higher, okay, after they're harvested. The first thing we want to talk about real fast is quality grade. This is probably something many of you have seen, USDA Prime, Choice, and Select. This is quality grade, and it's mostly centered around marbling. But if we break quality grade down into its real two parts, it comes down to maturity, how old the cattle are, and therefore the carcasses, and marbling. We've known this for 60, 80 plus years. Young cattle are more tender than older cattle. Okay. Does that make sense? The older the cattle get, typically the less tender they get. So if a 4-year-old steer grades prime, guess what? It could still have an eating experience like shoe leather and be tough, right? So those older animals are penalized according to the system. You could have an older animal also be tender, and we have some good grass finishing genetics in the state that are capable of tenderness at a later age, but that's a discussion for another time. This is a new one I'm going to try with you guys just to take you through quality grading. It's a video simulation. Can everyone hear? Let's start by going through a simulation
Yes.
of how to grade a beef carcass. The first step is to
Can it be
determine
turned up? Okay, there it goes.
you can use the fat deposition pattern. Can you steer it?
No.
Cod fat. Therefore, a steer carcass is present. As we move forward, the next will have I'll rewind that just so that's not missed to determine the sex of the carcass. And you can do that based on the fat deposition pattern. Heifers will have udder fat, whereas steers will have cod fat present. There's also a pizzoli over here, remnant of the penis anatomy over the H bone where that hip was broken, but that's another discussion. Based on what you see here on at the left, it's pretty easy to see that cod fat is observed. Therefore, a steer carcass is present. As we move forward, the next thing we need to determine is the maturity of the animal, the age of that carcass, and that's going to associate with physiological maturity. Why do we do this? Young cattle are tender, older cattle tend to be less tender. We look at the chine bones or the spine bones and how much those bones have ossified over time. And we're looking in the thoracic vertebrae for this. And as you can see, the carcass observed that left has those very, very prominent white buttons. So that means like they're still cartilaginous, they're more like rubber as opposed to bone. Less sturdy of the next thing we need to, how do we do that? Chine bone, thoracic vertebrae for this. And as you can see, the carcass observed that left has those very, very prominent white buttons. So we don't have advanced ossification, we don't have partial ossification. We have, in this case, no ossification, which is indicative of a young animal. This fits the A maturity designation well. The next thing we have to discuss is lean maturity, okay? The color and the texture of lean, and this is another indicator of physiological maturity of the carcass, another aspect of eating quality. We take a look here, we have a light cherry red color observed at left, and if we compare it to the color and texture of lean present in an A maturity, C maturity, or E maturity carcass, it's pretty easy to see that this is an A maturity carcass. And so we can go ahead and put two and two together and hopefully get four. We have skeletal maturity and lean maturity of A. Overall maturity is going to be there for an A. And there's different grades to that, degrees. We can get into that later if you have questions. Now that we've determined the maturity of the carcass, we need to look at the amount of marbling or intramuscular fat. That's the fat inside the muscle present of the ribeye. We have three different quality grades shown on the right. We have slight, modest, and moderately abundant. Slight meaning select, modest associated with average choice or middle choice, and moderately abundant associated with prime. The carcass at left clearly has slight marbling in this case, which is going to be reflective in its quality grade. So we have an overall maturity of A, and we have slight marbling. So we find the column for A maturity, we go down, slight, okay, that's a USDA Select carcass. Therefore, USDA Select is the quality grade for that particular animal, that particular. Okay, so as we get further into this, we kind of hammered out quality grade, marbling and maturity there. We want to talk about the rest of the carcass composition. Okay, so we want fat. We want fat in the muscle. We want taste fat, right? But we don't want extra fat on the outside, too much trim, waste fat. We want taste fat. We don't want waste fat. And one of the things we have to understand is as cattle get heavier and as cattle get older, their body composition changes. Okay, I was a lean, mean 22-year-old. Now, not so much. Okay, so the older we get, a little more fat as a percentage of our body increases usually, and muscle as a result will decrease. Bone tends to average out once you hit physiological mature size. It doesn't matter what mammal we're talking about on the earth. Okay, so we have yield grading to help estimate that. And what we're basically after is cutability. Okay, what is the lean yield going to be? We want quality, we want yield. There's a balance for eating quality and efficiency throughout the process. Yield grade is what we're going to talk about. That ranges from yield grade 1 through 5. 1 or a lower grade indicating a higher cutability, lean, a lot of red meat. 5 being a higher numerical yield grade indicating less cutability, less red meat. As we go from left to right here, you can see an array of carcasses. And just right now, if you looked at fat right off the bat, wow, you can see some differences, okay? There's a major difference in terms of lean meat or lean muscle showing from a yield grade 1 carcass on the far left to a yield grade 5 carcass, okay? Our 4-H animals are going to be more in the 2s and the 3s typically, and they're going to sometimes touch on being a 1 or sometimes get into the yield grade 4 category, typically. As we look at the yield grade formula, okay, we have some math to do later, but the big thing is how heavy are these carcasses, okay? And we know as carcasses get heavier, they get slightly fatter as a percentage of their other components, okay? Um, as it pertains to bone, bone doesn't change a whole lot. But as a percentage of the total carcass, the bone percentage typically decreases with size, okay? So how heavy is the carcass? The typical range is 600 to 900 pounds. If you bring a carcass or an animal that produces a carcass less than that, you're going to get docked in price most places around the country. If you bring an animal above 900 pounds, they might give you a small dock, or if you bring like a 1,400-pound carcass in, you may get a larger penalty. Okay. The next thing we want to do is split that carcass between the 12th and the 13th rib and look at a few things here. In red, we have the ribeye muscle. Okay. The first measurement we're going to take, though, has nothing to do with the ribeye. It's a measurement of fat. And that measurement is going to be taken 3/4 up of the length of the longissimus dorsi or the ribeye muscle. Okay, that's the sweet spot we're going to measure in inches. We're going to get that measurement and run with the ball. The back fat measurement is the greatest single indicator of yield grade, and that's kind of how the yield grading deal starts. You can do yield grading with formula and math. USDA graders has also been trained to do this based on visual specs, and they can often do a yield grade on a carcass in a matter of seconds. There's some camera grading systems now, X-rays, whole carcass scanning that has been going on in this country and others, and they're getting closer to having a more digitally verified version to measure these traits as well. But back fat thickness, this is where we're going to start. And the take home message of why do we measure back fat thickness? Well, we know the carcass weight already. So now we're getting an estimate of how lean or how trim the carcass is at that weight. Okay. The next thing we're going to look at is that ribeye. Okay. There's a couple of ways you can measure it. The easiest way is to put a grid over the top, count the squares, determine the ribeye area in square inches. And what we're asking now is, again, we know the weight, we know how trim the carcass is, how much muscle does this carcass have relative to his weight? So we measure the ribeye area. The next factor we look at is the percentage of kidney, pelvic, and heart fat. And so here we have a carcass that's hanging, and I don't know if you guys can see that transition. The carcass has kind of been shaded out. Okay, that's the kidney, pelvic, and heart fat present. This is a very easy thing to measure when you're a trained evaluator. Over time, you kind of just your eye is trained based on the weight of the carcass. You look at that, you're like, oh, okay, 2.5%, 4.25. It's the least indicative measure of cutability, and some plants now are actually removing the kidney, pelvic, heart fat early, and it's not even present on the carcass. Okay, luckily that makes a very, very little difference in terms of our ability to measure the cutability of the carcass, which is what we're after, right? Red meat yield. But still, what is this a measure of? How lean or trim the carcass is. We have a measurement on the outside of the carcass, and now we have a measurement of the visceral or internal fat that surrounds the organs. So we got weight, we got a measurement of fat on the outside, measurement of fat on the inside, and we got a muscle measure to roll with. Now we can figure out composition, okay? So we have all these things that we're going to put into a formula, or there's some shorthand ways to do it. Just to give you another flavor of what a yield grade 1 carcass looks like, a lot of red, not a lot of white, right? High red meat yield. There's some issues here with quality maybe, but we're just talking about yield at this point. Now we have a yield grade 2 carcass. As you can see, more covering of the total surface area with white, which is fat, relative to the lean that we saw before. A yield grade 3, showing a little bit more balance in terms of exterior fat cover. A yield grade 5. This animal moved to Momona Street about 65 days before it was harvested, and it continued to pack on more fat, right? And a yield grade 5. Um, yeah, this is really unacceptable. And this was more common years ago. And if you think about um, life, cattle, livestock industry, everything really, over time, things have gotten more expensive, right? So why would you continue to feed an animal if that feed is being converted not to muscle, but to fat? And not necessarily to taste fat, to waste fat, right? Spend more money on feed, more days on feed, less total carcass yield. Spend more, get less. Is that a good strategy? No. Ole. Okay. Is the Hawaiian immersion version of that answer. Another way to take a look at these carcasses, yield grade 1.7, a cross section through the chuck, a cross section through the rib, and a cross section through the hindquarter. Okay. There's a lot of teriyaki in that hindquarter, right? No question. A lot of red meat yield, a lot of muscle, and still enough fat to ensure a desirable eating experience. On the flip side of the coin, we have a yield grade 5.1. Okay. Big differences there. Oh, yeah. Um, your value after this carcass is cut up into the cuts that go to the consumer will be dramatically different. Years ago, I think it was 1995 or 1996, I remember being at the state show, and Scott Sakagawa had a steer that was heavily, heavily finished. And Bridget's dad actually said, um, that's a yield grade 5 utility. And he went like that. And you know what? He was right. The steer was a yield grade 5 and it graded utility with an 8.8-inch ribeye. Unbelievable. But that's basically what that steer looked like on the inside. Bridget now was running Hawaii Meats. If she had to deal with a lot of cattle coming in to the slaughter floor like this, they would have a hard time keeping the lights on. Okay. Yeah, they'd have to buy a lot of lean cows, okay, in order to use that fat. Because if not, it's just going to get thrown away, right? And when I say use that fat, I mean mix that with lean to make wholesome ground beef for adding value. So if we compare the two side by side, big difference, right? I mentioned earlier we don't want to chase the extremes. Most of the time, profitability in business and in life comes from avoiding extremes and trying to do well. Do 100%, okay? Give it your best effort and balance your inputs and try and line that up with your outputs so there's no diminishing returns, okay? So just to cover things, we know the hot carcass weight, we measured back fat thickness, we got the ribeye area. Whew, we got the kph too, right? Okay, we're cooking with gas. Now we have a yield grade formula, okay? We have some math to go ahead and do. We're not going to focus too much on the math. We have the formula. And I added the video and I put some of this stuff in just thinking if Asia, Yingwen, you guys were going to record this and use this in programs, at least you could capture that. Let's talk about some different ways to evaluate math. A few years ago, I had a couple of 4-Hers and one student that was an FFA, and we had 3 carcasses that were harvested on Maui, and they were all 750 pounds, like to the button. Weighed them several times. Okay, the first carcass had a yield grade of 1.5, the second carcass had a yield grade of 2.5, and the third carcass had a yield grade of like 3.48, basically 3.5. And they were all choice carcasses. Okay. So we decided to do more than just peel the hide off and look at the carcass. We did complete subprimal yields. And we've done about 30,000 subprimal yields on cattle in Hawaii. So we have a pretty good idea of how to measure this stuff for grain or grass finish. But as we look at these three 750-pound carcasses, let's dissect how yield grade and cutability fits into the overall carcass picture. So again, we got 3 of these choice 750-pound carcasses. We closely trimmed. So we basically did boneless, closely trimmed retail cuts, a face to 3/8 of an inch, and we got measurements of fat. We took all the bone out, we weighed and measured the bone, and then we also determined what the saleable red meat yield was. Subprimal cuts, baby, boneless. And so we got all the data. You can also express those traits as a percentage of the carcass weight. And as you can see, bone is the same, right? Cattle get bigger. They kind of there's a proportionality to it, okay? We're not talking about you don't see the Chihuahuas and Great Danes in cattle, right? So bone remains stable at that weight, but we see some differences in fat. Therefore, we see some differences in lean yield. What does that mean? What does that mean in terms of dollars and cents? Well, that 750-pound carcass broken down 3 different ways based on cutability. Again, that's due to genetics. They all came off the same management, okay? Same management, same feeding program. Um, we break them down. We see some of those differences that I expressed in the table, but look at the differences in value, okay? This is what gets me. The difference between the yield grade 1 and the yield grade 2 and the yield grade 1.5 and 2.5 was $119 in today's dollars, okay? Same weight carcass, $119. This is wholesale price, okay? If you're a grocer or if like say for example a rancher doing direct marketing or like say for maybe Bridget has her own ranch or maybe Hawaii Meats has a branded beef label and they're selling it different, this is wholesale price. So you can magnify this by 1.5 or 2 to fit whatever scenarios. But the yield grade of 1.5 versus the yield grade 2.5 was $120 more valuable. The yield grade 3.5 compared to the yield grade 2.5, there's an $83 difference between them. And if you compare that yield grade 3.5 steer to that yield grade 1.5 steer, that's $203 off the same carcass weight. Pretty crazy, right? So this tells us, and we're not even looking at extremes. We didn't go from yield grade 1 to yield grade 5. We went from realistic 1.5 to 3.5, and there was an ability to capture $203 in value based on yield off of a choice 750-pound carcass. Bridget knows this because she's in the industry, but in the mainland, the carcasses are a lot heavier than 750 pounds, right?
Yeah.
So if yeah, so if you added another 200 pounds to this, and these are 950-pound carcasses, you're talking about 610 dollars and I don't know, 63 and a half cents difference in value between choice 950-pound carcasses based on a numerical yield grade difference of 2. Pretty crazy, right? Okay. This could mean the difference between profitability or not if you're in the industry. We dive into the results from this year's carcass show. It's a cool set of carcasses. There's obviously some work that has gone into the genetics and the feeding. Right off the bat, I'll tell you this. If we were going to judge these carcasses solely on conformation, um, the reserve champ could easily be the grand champ in this scenario. The grand champ could be second, and there's some shifts. But when we start looking at the total picture with, value and some of the finer traits, we have some close decisions, and in some cases, some bigger separations in value, largely due to weight. Okay, but a really nice set of steers overall. Here's the table of results that everyone was furnished with. Haven steer was the grand champion carcass, and this steer has some special traits, some anomalies with it as well. But one of the things we do when we start the carcass show is we'll rib the carcasses and then give the carcasses time to bloom, and the carcasses as they bloom, that means like the marbling will, as a result of that muscle opening up and not being so tight, loosening up, the marbling flex will actually kind of pop and be bigger and easier. And that happened with almost all the carcasses. We also had two carcasses. Well, that was happening because the carcasses have a high end eating experience, low melting point fat. The marbling also goes a little bit translucent. So as we were doing the evaluation, and Bridget had a shroud, a camera shroud going over, and she took pictures as well. As that was happening, and we waited like 35, 40 minutes, some of the marbling was like disappearing on these carcasses. So we were taking pictures every few minutes to be able to record that. I'll show you some of that in a minute. But overall, really nice group of carcasses. We had two that were high choice, and I think those two high choice animals could have easily gotten into the prime category. But I mean, again, with the show steer situation, they're being moved. None of these came from off island. They're all Oahu steers, right? But stress and handling, cattle going off of feed because of a new environment, that's not great. But I do think we could feed these cattle to try and get more of them into the 1,250, 1,300 pound live weight range. And I think that's going to translate to a better overall eating experience and quality for the buyer. Okay. Um, we had a solid round of three choices, Kona, Wyatt, and Tristan. From a confirmation standpoint, Wyatt's carcass could easily be the third place steer here, but basically due to weight. Okay, when we look at quality grade and yield grade, there's a grid pricing formula. You see a grid price here. That's per hundredweight. If you move the decimal point two places, you can make that a per pound price. This is according to a grid in the mainland. Okay. Um, the difference in live weight between third and fourth was 1138 and 1115, but the difference in carcass weight as a result of dressing percentage, pretty pretty big, and that translates to more value. So we tried to line them up in terms of overall carcass conformation and overall value based on their carcass weights. The steer that went to Maui from Tristan Tevis, he was number seven in the Decoit's cooler. That was a nice steer. Okay. He had to hop on a boat in Hawaii 5 it from Oahu to Maui before he got harvested. That's a little extra transport, just like in years past, steers from Maui have to come over to Oahu before the fair. We don't know the true effect of that, and that could have affected carcass conformation. Maybe a little bit, but most indicate lean maturity, lean color. If there was a lot of stress, they could be darker and maybe burn off a little bit more marbling from the. But overall, that carcass looked pretty good, and there's a lot to be proud of and happy in this group. We did have three carcasses that fell a little bit short on the quality grade side. Um, Getting into the select. They call it supermarket select for a reason. So select isn't necessarily bad. It's just not what would be considered like a premium eating experience. A select could eat very well, much like a choice if it was tender. But if a select didn't have that marbling to sort of lubricate it during cookery and it was a little tough, two wrongs don't make a right, right? If it was tender, it could still produce a desirable eating experience. We don't know. We didn't measure tenderness. Okay. We didn't take any steaks away from the buyers. Shaughnessy steer, the biggest problem there was the weight. Okay. Under 600 pound carcass, that's unacceptable for the industry. What does that mean in the future to correct it? Just get the calf on a plain nutrition that's a little bit higher earlier. So feed them heavier a little earlier. or keep them on feed a little bit longer. And most of the time, those problems take care of itself. And if you feed them, they'll hit their genetic potential. The other things will improve as well. So even though that steer was small, it was a select plus, having a um, marbling score of 3.8. Had that steer been fed another 2 weeks without stress, it could have been a low choice. So that's good. I will say that there's a couple of animals here that deserve some merit, just from the standpoint of the amount of muscle they were packing relative to their carcass weight. Wyatt Gonzalez, he had that short steer that was built like a little freak. Okay, a lot of muscle, huge muscle relative to his carcass weight. A 2.09, it's almost a 2.1 ribeye per hundredweight. That puts you in like the top, 1 or 2% of finished cattle as it pertains to muscle relative to hundredweight. Preston steer 2.07 the same way. That's packing a lot of muscle. And Henry Silva steer, 1.9 to 2.0 is considered like, really, really good, great. Um, we just give those animals their props and their breeders for putting that muscle under the hide. And then we had one steer from Trenton. Um, the animal looked decent from the outside, but under the hide, we had some challenges. It was very pale. I didn't dock it as it would be like a full dark cutter, but it was practically devoid of marbling. And if you have a dark cutter, you penalize quality grade one more. So in this case, it was barely a standard. It could have been a utility as well. So this is something we want to, and you know, if you think of movies and all that, have you guys ever heard of that movie Forrest Gump? There's a famous there's a famous quote in that movie, "Life is like a box of chocolates, you never know what you're gonna get." Okay, you can't see under the hide and know how these animals are necessarily going to gain or how they are going to grade when you pick them. There's 500 pound calf, 600 pound calf. It's November, December, early January. You pick this animal. You hope they have the genetics, right, to be able to gain and grade. You feed them, they grow, and then at the end, like you do everything right, and sometimes it doesn't work out. So in the case of that carcass 31980 that tagged 337 calf, it just didn't work out. Placed better live than it did, but this is like the first standard carcass I can remember in like the last decade. That's a problem. That's a problem. We don't want to see this in the program, and it's not always anybody's fault. Sometimes it just happens. Maybe that calf got really stressed out and it burned off some of its fat stores, but um, it had fat on the outside. Okay, it had 3/10 of fat on the outside, so it wasn't quite finished, but it had enough cover. But just in that muscle, there wasn't very much intramuscular fat, and more so than that, the muscle texture itself was really coarse. So when you see lean texture there in the column, fine and very fine typically means you have a high chance, high probability of producing a tender eating experience, with the animal being either very tender elite or at least tender, requiring a shear force to shear the muscle of less than 8 pounds. When it starts getting slightly coarse or slightly coarse, you're going to have to do some chewing. Okay. What could affect that? Well, one, genetics right off the bat. Okay. Stress, if an animal is stressed for a couple of weeks. Okay. This year we had the Kona lows that hit us in the spring. I wouldn't be very surprised if a whole bunch of cattle went off feed for a couple of weeks. Okay. So genetics, stress, and also these are all steers, right? At some point they were bulls. We all agree? If they were castrated at a day old, a week old, 2 weeks old, at 2 months or 3 months, at branding or at weaning, or maybe this was still a bull and he was 600 pounds and almost a year of age, and then he was brought in, hey, I need a steer. Okay, boom, castrate it. A later cut bull would also have some of these characteristics of more muscle, and as a result of having those androgens, testosterone around, they would have a coarser, lean texture even at slaughter, and that would lead to less tenderness and a less desirable eating experience. Okay, but overall, I like what I see. Recommendations as a group: feed them. Okay, you can't starve a profit out of an animal. Feed them and trying to get them into that 1,200 pound at least live weight. Only good things can happen if you can do that. The next thing I would say is at Hawaii Meats, they use a hide puller, and sometimes some of the outside fat gets taken off. Okay, on one of these carcasses, it's actually a kind of a nice thing that they did do that because there was a blemish that was obviously a result from an injection site lesion on one of the animals. So if you give them a shot, you want to give it to them in the neck. This is a quality assurance thing. Okay. As a result, that hide puller pulled some of that fat in that area and it took a little bit more off. And it's not necessarily somebody made a mistake with the hide puller. There would happen to be like if you cut wood, there's a knot in the wood and the saw blade hits that, and it's like "Oop," there's a hard spot right there. There was part of an injection site there. So the good thing is that injection site lesion never made it into the muscle, into the steaks that'll go to the buyer. But it's just something for us to be cognizant of. Give the injections according to beef quality assurance guidelines. It's something talked about in the YQCA trainings earlier in the year. In the neck, ahead of the shoulder, in the middle of the neck. When you put the needle in, get it all the way in, depress the plunger to aspirate to make sure you're not in a vein, right? You're not giving an intravenous shot, and then deliver the appropriate dose. Okay. This is an example of one of those oddities. Time lapse photography early on versus, and this is what about 28 minutes later. Same animal, same carcass, different ribeye. Um, Captured roughly, I guess we got 23 pictures, but as you look at the digital marbling expression, you can see there's some changes over time, right? There's some animals that have low melting point fat and the marbling becomes less obvious. It's still there. If you drop the temperature in the room further, sometimes you can see that. No one is paid on this right now. It's either you grade or you don't. But these are some subtle things. If you're trying to select for low melting point, some of the more desirable fatty acids, oleic acid, a lot of people raising Wagyu, this is actually something that matters. So we can actually interpolate that on those eyes, and we have it for a whole bunch of them. It may be a part of a research release study later on. But as we wrap it up, I want to take questions. I didn't want to go more than an hour. I figured I could get this out in about 40 minutes. I want to thank a few individuals and groups. One, the breeders, okay? If the breeders don't provide animals for the kids, you're done, okay? The youth, they need support, and that's what the volunteers do each and every year. 4-H is a volunteer-run organization. Okay, they're the lifeblood of the program. You also have to have a strong commitment from the buyers. Okay, people from the community, family, friends, local businesses who support the program. Nothing happens when it comes to a market contest if you can't harvest the animals and get them processed. So I want to extend a huge thanks to Bridget Kapahu and their staff at Hawaii Meats. Kiawe is on as well. They're always available. They provide a lot of support for us. And really, if you think about it, they're running a big business and they kind of shut down what they're doing to allow us as guests to come in there and get these measurements. And you have to understand, like, we're interrupting their line speed. So we appreciate their time and their effort, which is very precious. One of these animals was also harvested on Maui, so shout out to Cindy Paris and her group at Decoits for the support. University of Hawaii, CTAR, College of Tropical Ag and Human Resilience. I have to learn how to say that now because it was always human resources from the time I was gestating in my mom. And the 4-H program for continuing to provide great youth opportunities throughout the state. A lot of other people involved that deserve recognition, and at this point, I'll take any questions.
Does anyone have any questions? In the email, I did suggest that the 4-H members who are going to jump on have at least one question prepared for Kyle. We really do appreciate the time that he's taken to hop on Zoom and make this an educational thing. So, if you guys have any questions for him, now would be the time to ask and pick his brain about anything about like your carcass, how to improve your carcass quality, nutrition, and things of that nature. So, anyone have any questions? Trenton, do you have any questions?
No.
No questions. Nadia, do you have a question?
Um, does like the bone structure matter for the carcass?
Bone structure. So like they all have bone, but I think the role of bone has been overplayed relative to like livestock judging for a number of years. Did we just lose her?
No,
No,
she's
I'm
still.
still here.
Okay. I thought we lost somebody from the call. So like heavy bone, light boned, moderate bone. Typically speaking, those animals that are heavy boned are also going to weigh more. So still as a percentage of that carcass, the bone doesn't change a whole lot. Now on a really light boned animal, you could make the argument that they will have a higher meat to bone ratio. Okay, and it doesn't matter what species we're talking about. But if there's less bone, well, as just as a percentage, there's a higher percentage of, muscle and or fat, right? Does that make sense? Most of the time, while that is true and those relationships are true, a lighter boned animal is also going to weigh less. So you may have a higher percentage of not bone, either fat or muscle, but you're going to have a lighter overall carcass. Pounds pay the bills. Quality pounds pay more bills. It's probably the way we need to think about it. From a livestock judging standpoint, we don't always get some of the bits of common sense that are supposed to go along with it. So you want enough bone for the animal to be able to walk, do its job, and not break down over time. But if you're out there selecting for bone as a major quality, you're probably not going to be in the business very long. And the females that you keep back as replacements that are freaky heavy boned, they're probably not going to last. Okay. If we put every breed out in the range, we may not like the answer, but a damn longhorn or a Corriente cross cow is probably going to last a little longer than everything else, right? They have less to maintain. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
I have a question. Maybe it'll stir more. It's a two-part because I've had this discussion with several people at the fair as well. But how much of a successful carcass is determined by genetics versus feeding management? And then can an excellent feeding overcome poor genetics?
Ooh, okay. Yeah, that's like one of those. Yeah, it's a mic drop question. Well, it's a great question. So, like, for some of if you're talking about growth and muscle, those traits are typically highly heritable, and they're going to be about 40% to 50% heritable. Okay. So, what that means is genetics are driving how far the car can go, and the feeding program will kind of dictate whether or not it gets there or how fast it'll get there. That's if that makes sense. So in a lot of ways, it's 50-50. If you have a moderate growth calf and you know that, and how would you know that? Oh, well, it's small framed or moderate framed versus like a limousine cross that's, big, tall, and whatnot. You probably know right off the bat. The big one needs more energy than the little one. The long way home with less energy can probably get that little calf to its place cheaper, but it's going to take you more time. That big steer, if you don't supplement it with the requirements for its growth, is probably going to look haggard all the way. Now, if it after like 25 years of being in this, I would say if an animal has been on full feed, and full feed doesn't mean like it has pasture, okay? Full feed is you're meeting its requirements for like, the 4-H program, or if it's in a feedlot. If the animal has been on full feed for 89 to 93 days and is at least 13 and a half to 14 months old at harvest, if that calf has the genetic potential to grade choice, there's a pretty good chance that it's going to grade choice. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
And it might have another way to look. So we're talking about days on feed, right? So basically 90 days on full feed. In the case of these 4-H steers, like pre-show, they might have 3 pre-shows on Maui, sometimes 4. There's a beef steer tour. They're in the trailer, they're going places, moving and shaking, carburetor behind. That's a little bit of stress. So they're going to need a little bit more Maybe it's not 90 days. Maybe for a 4-H steer, it's 120 days. That's 4 months of being on full feed. That doesn't mean they have to be 90% concentrate, 10% grass, but that means you have to be meeting their needs.
Mhm.
Another way to look at that is if it's a British calf breed composition and they have a quarter of an inch of fat, there's probably a good chance they could eke into choice already. But I think for most breeds and cross breeds, if you can get them to get an outside back fat cover of 4/10 of back fat, so not quite half an inch, 4/10 of back fat, if they have the genetics to allow them, they'll grade choice. So I always have said, based on advice I've gotten and things I've seen, you don't feed for prime.
Mhm.
You breed for prime and you feed for choice.
Mhm.
Yeah, because continuing throwing money into a fire doesn't really help you. So if that calf is getting like 6/10 of back fat and it's jiggling, okay, it jiggles when it moves.
Mhm.
Feeding that thing for another 30 days, you're probably not going to get yourself into a higher prime. You
Yeah.
may make the carcass heavier and make that animal and carcass more valuable just because of weight, but you're probably not going to feed yourself into a higher tier of quality grade. For 4-H steers, and I think your dad would say the same thing. If you get them to a half inch of outside fat cover,
Mhm.
they're going to have evidence of fat in their brisket. They're going to have evidence of fat over their rib. They're going to have fat on their tailhead, and they're going to have fat in their flank and in their scrotum, their cod. If genetics allow, they should be able to express their potential, whether it's low choice, middle choice, high choice, low
Mhm.
prime, or high select. But that's an excellent question. So you can't have one without the other, right? A small frame calf may look good because it has lower energy requirements, but it's not going to weigh up, so it's not going to have the value either, right? So you're trying to align the stars and get the right combination of growth, the right combination of outside fat cover to get them finished, properly finished, so they produce a nice carcass. But you
Mhm.
don't necessarily want to when that you want to get the taste fat, but if you keep feeding them and you get more and more of that waste fat without the return, I don't think that's a good thing for the program either. Yep. And then the other thing that goes on with this too is I will say it's pretty clear. We have some cattle in the program that have some ear or some Bos Indicus, some Brahman blood. It could be Brahman, Beefmaster, Brangus, Braford, Charbray, crosses. Those cattle have a chronological age. Like they're born January 1st, December 1st, they're still, or some December 31st, they're a year old, right? You guys follow me? Physiologically, those cattle and like some of the limousines are later maturing. So what happens is their chine bones, their ossification, they could be 30 months old, but their chine bones may only look like they're 24 months because they have later maturing genetics, but they're still a maturity cattle. When we look at their lean, and Bridget knows this, people in the meat industry that know, Gavi knows this. When you look at some of those eyes and you look at the lean texture, and it's supposed to be fine and very nicely textured, and you look at it and it looks like um, rough and coarse, or like somebody cracked some safety glass.
Mhm.
That's another case where chronological age, they might be older, but physiological age is not showing up in their spine on the bones, but it's showing up in the lean. Or those cattle went through a big drought, or those cattle were excessively stressed. Those things show up as well. We can see that when we do the carcass show. We're not going to penalize them as heavily. If they're too old, well, they're out, right? They're disqualified. But those are some things that affect quality grade because we want the people buying these carcasses to be happy with them. We don't want them to be like, oh, can you pass another knife to go with this knife so I can cut the meat? Yeah. We want them to call Bridget up on the phone and be like, it was so good, even the bone was tender. We chew the bone. Okay. That's what we want when the 4-H program is brought up.
It's like butter.
Like butter.
Okay, any more questions?
I will say this, if we're gonna go off of just confirmation alone without looking deeper, like say for example, we split the eyes, we didn't care about carcass weight. Um, I think you'd have, hold on one second, let me bring that up. You could have a, and this isn't to create controversy or anything like that. I'm just saying like it's nice when the competition is high, so you actually have um it pushes everyone to get better. But Preston steer, or excuse me,
Austin.
Austin steer. Oh my gosh, I'm
Right by our wrong child.
yeah. As people get older, so this diminished mental capacity sometimes happen, right? Yeah, Austin steer. Just from the looks of it, as soon as you split those eyes, I think nine people walking down out of 10 would have probably been like, oh, that's a good chance that's going to be the champion carcass. And after 20 minutes, you're like, oh, yeah, okay, pretty close. And when you start doing the metrics and weighing them up and value wise, it fell just a little bit short, but that's a heck of a steer. If it had more marbling, it'd be elite. But, those cattle, um, the on that carcass, like these things are hanging on a hook. The when did they get processed, if you don't mind me asking?
They're already broken into primals right now and
Okay.
going into state cuts this week.
Okay, so
Some of them are already partly done.
they got the hang for like 2 weeks.
Mhm.
That's perfect. Okay, see that's another thank you, Bridget and Hawaii Meats for doing that. But that steer, um, let me think. Passenger side left hock, that tendon, there was a little bit of like fluid. So basically what I'm trying to get at is that steer on one side of its carcass, the animal's hanging up by its hock, right, from the ocole down. That one side, it appears that there was like some either an injury or compensation for an injury somewhere else. And as a result, like that, there was like a slight amount of inflammation and fluid buildup. Minor, like I don't think you'd even notice it. But something like that, if the animal was under some sort of like physiological stress with an injury, there's a good chance an animal like that may not have eaten as well for a little while, and it may have been a little bit more stress on it. And that particular carcass also had on one side of the beef, which is really strange, kind of like a mosaic of color change in the lean, which is another reason why we stayed in the cooler longer. We gave every one of these things a chance to whatever glycogen stores were there, blah blah blah. We didn't penalize anything prematurely, so we let time be the missing ingredient to make sure we got great calls on everything. But yeah, so if you're doing just carcass confirmation alone and looking at ribeye and muscle, just confirmation, not value. Austin Sear could have been first, Havens would have been second, Wyatt's would have been likely third, Kona's would have been fourth, Tristan's would have been fifth, and then the others would have stayed the same. But when you start going and looking um, with a fine-tooth comb at some of the other traits that dial into a elite eating experience, that helps separate the grain from the chaff or the cream from the crop. And we were able to assign value, real commercial value in the industry on a wholesale basis to some of these, and reward those with the extra merit. So technically we're still under an hour because we started at what, 7:06, 7:07.
No, Kyle, I'm so proud. Thank you so much.
I
Any
could
questions for anyone else? No questions? All right. Kyle, anything else?
No, I just want to again thank you guys. And yeah, volunteers and the industry support are vital to the program. And I appreciate Yingwin, Asia, Jeff, everybody who gave their efforts there on the industry side, Bridget, Kiave. It's a pleasure to come over there. I only get to see you a couple times a year, but thank you for always having great hospitality and servicing the kids for not just the beef, but for the pork, and then for helping make this happen. This is like the one thing that helps connect like what they're actually doing back to the industry, right? So it's kind of neat that we still have this venue, and then yeah, all the volunteers, you guys are doing a hell of a job, and your leaders, and it. I mean, I love 4-H, and some of the stuff you have to it's burning some at times, let's be honest, but continue to do it. You're the lifeblood of the program, like literally the blood and the veins. So stay within the body, please.
That's right. Thank you guys so much for all your hard work. And thank you, Kyle, for doing this presentation and giving us this final piece to their projects. And everyone's worked super hard these last couple of months. Like Kyle was saying, thank you to Hawaii Meats and Bridget for allowing us to do the carcass evaluation at your facility. Um, Thank you to Yunwin. Thank you to the volunteers and everyone else for being on tonight. We do have a very short 5 question survey in the chat. I'm going to just enter that there. Yeah, Kyle, one more.
I just want one more thing. Like, when these cattle are going to this facility in Kunia and they're getting water and all that, it would probably benefit the exhibitors if they either use a dechlorinating product or at least, before they gave watered their animals. We talked about this a little bit on Oahu. Um, Filling your buckets up with water and letting them off gas overnight. And if you have to take something like strawberry Kool-Aid or something like that just to get those cattle drinking water, because I will say, and Bridget probably noticed this as well, but there's about 4 of these carcasses that were there that looked like they may have had a little excessive tissue shrink, which means that these cattle were dehydrated.
Yeah.
So showmanship and stockmanship starts at home. So if you can, prior to the show, get those cattle used to drinking something like water with some strawberry Kool-Aid or something like that in it, right? And then when they're at the fair, it's new water. Have it in bucket, let it just uncovered, not with the cover, let it off gas overnight, get the chlorine out, and mix some of that strawberry Kool-Aid or something like that in it. They have something that they already know, and they can keep drinking water because I wouldn't be surprised if some of these carcasses lost an extra 20 to 30 pounds and just because they were dehydrated for no
What
other
was the
reason.
formula that you gave at County Show? What did you tell the kids to do?
Well, there's a couple different things you can do, but I would say like the water, or maybe if we just calendar it for maybe April next year, we can do like a Zoom and just cover some of this stuff like pre county show prep. We
Yeah,
can knock some of that
that'd
stuff
be
out.
great.
But yeah, I'd say there were 3 that were really showing tissue shrink and one that was moderately showing tissue shrink. And it showed up on some of the carcass yields, I think on Bridget's spreadsheet quite a bit. But just like, if you ship cattle to the mainland in a container, the stress, they're dehydrated. Um, if you squeeze the blood out of a turnip, don't be surprised if it's a little smaller, right? So we just got to find a way to get these cattle not only hydrated, but to keep their electrolyte balance. And then muscle is still a lot of it's protein, right, and structure, but it's also water consideration for next year.
Thank you,
I know I've
Kyle.
done for Friends Club. She has asked, and they've done 2 tours, I think, here so far. But if it would help that Kyle, you want to put on like some kind of, obviously I only have grass fed, but if you wanted to put on some type of carcass evaluation of grass fed markets that we have hanging, let me know, and then we can see what we have in schedule, and then you're welcome to have whatever kids that are here that are interested in coming do something.
That's awesome.
That's
That's awesome.
amazing. Yeah, thank you, Bridget.
That's why the industry is still the backbone for 4-H. We don't have the infrastructure. I mean, the industry does. So we're kind of right on their shoulders. So I appreciate that. Well, if that's all, I'm gonna take my Okole and drive home and try and catch my daughter before her bedtime.
Thank you again, Kyle. Thank
All
you,
right.
everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Right, have a good
Have a
night.
good one.
Good night.